The 90s and 2000s were a pretty weird time for religious media in America. Around that time, evangelical Christianity was beginning to see the beginnings of its end. The so-called moral majority was long since a thing of the past, and popular Christian TV shows such as the PTL Club had already long collapsed due to fraud and corruption. That said, folks in the hardcore Christian communities still saw opportunity. They correctly recognized that Christian people like to buy Christian stuff, especially mainstream stuff wrapped in a veneer of God-loving wholesomeness. That's doubly the case for kids, where purchasing decisions are largely made by their parents. After all, some parents were way more comfortable buying stuff for their kids if it came from a Christian bookstore. As such, the 90s and 2000s were beset with an explosion of Christian media content. Groups like DC Talk, Skillet, Newsboys, and Jars of Clay began to come into their own and gain niche popularity. Direct-to-video Christian cartoons such as VeggieTales took their Christian world by storm. And, of course, Christian fictional novels such as the Left Behind series were smash hits. Of course, there was one other form of media where some Christian companies tried to make a godly buck: video games. Needless to say, early efforts in the Christian video game world were pretty bad. I'm far from the first person to say this. One of the angry video game nerds' earliest videos was a 21-minute long video parodying bad Bible games on retro consoles. But there's one fascinating dumpster fire of a game that is so unsuccessful that it's rarely talked about nowadays. It's a game that I came across as a kid via a religious friend of mine, and one that I think about way more than I should. That game is Saints of Virtue, a 1999 Christian Doom clone made by Shine Studios and published by Cactus Games. At a high level, Saints of Virtue is a first-person shooter that combines fairly low speed and unwieldy shooting mechanics with a lot of exploring mechanics, while throwing in Bible verses where possible. In the game, you explore admittedly massive in-game levels to destroy representations of various Christian vices, locate Bible verse scrolls and items, and use those Bible verse scrolls and items to open doors and otherwise progress through various levels. As you can probably tell from the video, combat in the game is bad. The engine is so janky as to render the entire gameplay process uncomfortable. Each of your sword shots takes forever. The enemy's shots track your body such that strafing to dodge is often impossible, and aiming surprisingly difficult due to floaty controls, whether or not you use a mouse. This process becomes a bit easier when you get the rapid-fire sword, but not by much. Also, as you can probably tell from the video, the presentation of the game is quite bad, and not in an endearing retro way. The muddy and repeating textures and odd geography of the levels make exploring the game a chore, meaning that you have to play the majority of the game with the in-game map open. Moreover, most music in the game is at best a 10-second loop, making the game surprisingly effective as a torture device. Saints of Virtue was developed on the Acnex 3 engine, that is the predecessor to 3D Game Studio. The game didn't run all that well even when it was released, and definitely doesn't run well now. If you have any interest in this game, a dude with way too much patience has put together a combination of DOSBox and various patches to make the game run better, and he calls it Saints X. I highly recommend it if you do want to play, you play that version. Unfortunately, even with the improvements made by Saint X, the game is still a pain, and it has a ton of issues. In multiple instances throughout my playthrough, I had a bug where I'd clip through the floor and be unable to get back to solid ground. As such, a large part of the recording I did for this video is via cheats, as it was the only reliable way I could get to certain areas of the game. Regardless, what's most amusing to me is how Saints of Virtue tries to tell messages through its gameplay, and how muddled those messages become. Let's begin with the first level, Amphitheater of Apathy. It's basically 5 areas in one, with the player encouraged to go back and forth between different areas to solve various puzzles. For example, in level 1, the player must go to the Cave of Loneliness to find a rock, then throw that rock across a chasm to go further in the Pits of Despair. That said, the really interesting levels are the Mall of Distractions, the Media Maze, and the Gallery of Nothingness. The Mall of Distractions is by far what I remember the most. The entire area is fashioned after a 90s era shopping mall, except that all items you try to grab turn into dust when you touch them. The idea, of course, is that materialism is bad. Then things get a little weird. In the Media Maze, there are a number of rooms making fun of then-popular celebrities, including, this room. A room where distorted images of celebrities are shown with monkey noises. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be funny, racist, or, both. A lot of the images in the Media Maze seem to be downloaded from the internet, so the entire level becomes a fun game of guess the movie or celebrity. For example, I was a bit surprised to find a poster of A Clockwork Orange in a Christian video game. In the Gallery of Nothingness, the whole point seems to be that art is dumb and pointless, and in some sense reliant on atheist principles. Of course, this seems to be mostly an attack on modern art, as I suspect the creators of Saints of Virtue would be perfectly happy with old-school Rip Jesus-style art. During your explorations in the first level, you'll have to fight representations of vanity and worldliness. Honestly, they're pretty cool enemies, and could be genuinely a bit unsettling when I was a kid. In any event, after finding and using the right Bible verses and pushing the right buttons, you'll be able to escape from level 1. Level 2 is the Labyrinth of Legalism, which is all about, quote, belief systems based on worldly works, unquote. Your guess as to what that actually means is as good as mine. Level 2 is bad. It is one long, poorly designed maze on a really crummy engine, making it a patience-testing nightmare of bugs and staring at a map. More specifically, each area of the level, including the twisty maze, the trap dungeon, the abstract maze, and the rules maze, is frustrating, and level 2 is generally the place where I'd stop playing this game when I was younger. All of it is a gigantic, uninspired maze. None of it is fun or interesting, and I won't talk about it much. The only thing worth mentioning about this portion of the game is that the enemies are fairly cool. The fear enemies, for example, tend to jump out of nowhere and run at your player, which is startling and kind of fun. That said, you just blast them with your religious sword like everything else. In any event, this is also the part of the game with the most annoying bugs, so debug mode is effectively essential to get past this part of the game. Rather than constantly dealing with a buggy engine that makes completing some mazes all but impossible, you can just warp around, collect the right scrolls, knock down some pillars, and apparently destroy a castle or something. Then you can finally escape to level 3, where things get interesting again. Level 3 is New Age Nirvana, which is exactly what it sounds like, but with more possible racism. At first, you go through 4 areas: the Love and Peace Temple, the Mountains of Relativity, the Shrine of Heaven, and the Earth Shrine. All 4 seem to be some sort of critique of Eastern mythologies, at least in some way, although it's not particularly clear what the critique is meant to say. I really did spend some time trying to figure out what the message of this area was, and it never quite figured it out. Sometimes the game felt like it was joking about Asian art, whereas other times it felt like it was being preachy. The level is ostensibly about emphasizing that people cannot become their own gods, suggesting that the level is indeed an attack on Buddhism. That said, it's all indirect and comes off more as an attack on Asian design than an attack on Asian religion. Thankfully, this message gets cleared up a bit as you enter the final part of Level 3, the Temple of Man. It's a big representation of arrogance and self-glorification, which also happen to be the enemies of this level. Hilariously, the Temple of Man includes a lot of stuff that is purported to represent self-glorification. That includes, among other stock images clearly downloaded from the internet, hair dryers and the existence of NATO. The developers also try to make fun of Cameroon for some reason. To beat the level, you literally destroy a golden idol of yourself, which allows you to escape into the final level. The 4th and final level is the Domain of the Heart, which is a portion of the game that I suspect very, very few people ever saw. That's probably a good thing. Like Level 2, Level 4 is a nightmare maze that has no redeeming qualities. You wander around endless fields of nonsense, trying desperately to get out, and looking for small little corridors that lead to more endless wandering. The first 3 areas of Level 4, the swamplands of selfishness, the ruins of pride, and the path of perseverance, are all just boring. There's a cool ambiance to them for about 2 seconds, but the appeal is lost when you've spent 2 hours trying to get out of them. I feel bad even including them in this video. As for messages, it's pretty on-the-nose stuff. Selfishness is bad, pride is bad, you have to persevere and be a good person, etc. The only redeeming part of Level 4 is the final area, the Temple of the Heart. It's a mishmash of various ideas, but it basically just shows a lot of religious iconography and trippy visuals. It's creative, which makes it much more endearing than anything else in Level 4. Once you reach the Temple of the Heart and find a few items, all you have to do is knock yourself off the throne of your own heart and replace a golden cross, representing Jesus, and you win the game. Big picture, I think Saints of Virtue is an excellent example of why Christian video games never took off quite like Christian books, movies, and music did. On paper, Saints of Virtue is a good idea. The general concept of a first-person shooter with exploration and puzzles is a good one, and it's generic enough to be applied to a lot of different contexts. Along those lines, FPS adventure games are still being made to this day. The Beksinski-inspired game Vomitorium, for example, is arguably not much more than the same fundamental concept of Saints of Virtue, albeit done properly. The thing is, Christianity is more than an art style. If you're going to make a Christian game, then you've ostensibly got to add some sort of religious message or religious education into that game. That's hard to do. In fact, educational games as a whole are hard to do. It's sometimes hard to forget how good companies like Broderbund were at making educational games, but the point still stands. It's hard to cram preachy material into a fun game and keep that game fun. Along those lines, while you can sneak little religious undertones into a book or song fairly easily, it's a lot harder to do that with a video game. That's especially the case when the primary market for video games enjoys them for fun, not for personal edification. All the same, Saints of Virtue could have been better. Its message is an incomprehensible mess, to the point where I couldn't tell whether it was making jokes, being racist, or trying to make a religious statement. That's a really, really bad position for a game to be in. In sum, Saints of Virtue is considered by many to be abandonware, and that's probably where it should stay. It's a product of its time. It's a clear attempt to be a cool Christian video game in an era of rampant interest in making Christianity cool, which, per Hank Hill, never worked even for Christian rock.
Can't you see you're not making Christianity better, you're just making
Video game
worse?
Thank you very much for watching this video. As always, I look forward to your feedback in the comments.